Okay, today, before we start, we have to make you third world grain producers, because you gotta get in your mind how you do this kind of stuff. This is partial training too for the apocalypse. You know, when everything goes south, and you got to figure out how to feed yourself, and you decide, you know what, watering the lawn is stupid. I should plant wheat instead because I need to live. But even if you planted wheat in the front yard instead of grass, which is a grass, by the way, we don't know how to process it to eat it. So this is food processing 101. This is barley or wheat. So you know when you grow barley or wheat, it really is a grass and it has a seed head at the top, right? And then you have to let it mature and you have to let it dry on the stalk, preferably, because or else it's not going to separate. So you let it dry. Good. Okay. Check. We got that. Good. And then once it dries, then what you need to do is separate the heads from the stalk. And you know how to do that, right? You can beat it, actually, and you can beat it with sticks. You can beat it against a wall. Just do something to just knock the stalks and now you've got whole kernels, but you still got to do something to those kernels, right? On the outside of the kernels is this hyper protective armor. It's called the hull, and that armor, and it's totally non-digestive. Don't try and eat that. It's like they take that stuff after they separate it off the kernels, and they put it in pillows, and you can buy pillowcases. Full of that. So it's good for. Okay, so then you have to separate that hull off of the actual seed. How do you do that? Well, again, you have to beat it, or you have to hit it, or you have to do something to it. In the Gospels, Jesus' apostles, they're walking through a field to feed themselves. If you just roll it between your hands, works really, really good to do that. The problem is once you finish doing that, you can either rub it between your hands, you can beat it with a stick against something dry, you can put it on the ground and have your animals walk on it. That's the ancient way to do it. Some way to just kind of get that husk to come off of the seed. Then you still have a handful of seeds and husks, and you can't eat that. You have to separate the husks, that hull, from the seeds. So you blow it. In fact, if the apostles, when they did that, they probably just went like this, and the hulls being light flake off, right? And then the whole things are left. That's how you process. So what we're seeing in this picture right here is this still being done in the eastern part of the world. So what you do after you've got the heads off, you rub them, and after they're rubbed, then instead of blowing on them, if you just drop them from a height and hope that there's a slight wind coming across the picture, then the wind will take the light hulls, blow them off of your tarp, and allow the heavy seed grains to fall to the bottom. Combine works a whole lot better, I know. But I always wonder what combines do, because they go through the field and they're cutting up this stuff, and then all this big chute, there's this perfect wheat coming into the truck. I'm going, how in the world? That's what's going on. There's like 100 little monkeys in there that are doing this and they're scraping off the hulls. So you buy it at the store, it's already processed. You buy it at the store, and even on top of that, it's all ground up. It's ready to go. So what do you need? Okay. So now, yeah, that's right. Karen grinds your own, right? So yeah, so you can do that. Okay, so now you're prepped for Ruth today. Because the entire scene of Ruth is actually in this process of harvesting. And in Israel, the harvesting time for barley is earlier than it is for wheat. Barley harvest is it's roughly mid-March to mid-April, that time of year. And then the month after that is the wheat harvest. It's pretty much the same process. So from the time you get to the end of February, early March, the grain is mature and it's actually drying on stalk. And then that plus the wheat, by the time you get to the beginning of the summer, that's your harvest for both are done. So that's what we're looking at today. Okay, so now you're ready for the apocalypse and you're ready for Ruth, which is why I have that little symbol, because there's a double meaning in that symbol. Little stalks of grain, and there's two of them. Remember, this is a romance. Da-na-na-na-na. Okay, we looked back last week. Our hook was the fact that when you read Matthew 1 and you look at the genealogy of Jesus, he mentions in the genealogy a couple of women. And Ruth is one of those women, as is Rahab. So when we looked at this, we thought, well, we need to understand who this Ruth is. We know who Rahab is, right? She's the prostitute that lived in the wall at Jericho, red string, spies, blah, blah. We looked at that a long time ago. But Ruth, we don't know much about except for the book of Ruth. So that's why we're looking at that to find out why she's included here. And we'll come back to this at the end of today, because this has some very interesting little hints in it. So Ruth is the great-grandmother of David, and then after this in Matthew 1's account, we see the genealogy from David all the way up to Jesus, proving, in fact, that he is of the bloodline of David, which is important for the Messiah. Okay, so let's come in. We're coming into chapter 2 today, and Ruth, I said, is a romance of faith, hope, and love. Last week we looked at the faith aspect, and today we're going to look at the hope aspect of this entire story. And a romance of faith. Last week, the faith she had, remember, the faith she had was the faith in Israel's God and Israel's people, Israel, and in particular, one of Israel's people, that is Naomi, who's there. So she is leaving behind her entire life and everybody she knows back in Moab. I mean, leaving totally for the whole purpose of accompanying Naomi back into her land where it's there. And she's saying, where you live, I'm going to live. Where you die, I'm going to die. I'm going to be with you everywhere you go, Naomi. This is her mother-in-law. And also, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. That is a total statement of faith. She's leaving behind everything and putting her trust entirely in the people of God and the people of God's God himself. So that's what she did last week. So today they are back in Bethlehem. And again, since we're in this gleaning process, Ruth and Naomi, her mother-in-law, are in Bethlehem and trying to survive amongst Naomi's people. So Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, let me go to a field, glean among the ears of grain after him in whose sight I shall find favor. So this is how you get by if you do not own land, but you have to feed yourself anyway. This is what widows would do, even orphans many times. So what you do is when the harvest happens, big old field, and the people who own the field start to harvest it. And instead of using a combine, Steve, they would have a team of people. And normally you would have the young men or the grown men, but the men would have the big cutting sickles. You've seen that picture of the guys going rah like that. I did that once, clearing weeds with a weed sickle. Have you done that? Oh man, buy a weed eater because these sickles. So think about using one of these traveling knives that you have two handles on, and it comes down at ankle level, and then shoo, and you get one bunch of wheat, shoo, and another bunch of wheat. And when you cut it, it falls to the ground. You don't do anything. It falls to the ground. And then behind you is a team of people, usually youth or women are the ones that come behind, and they would come behind and they would take all of these that have fallen to the ground, they would collect them up, and they would usually bind them so they would be standing grain, big sheaves of grain. That's what the people who came behind did. And then, if it turned out that there were needy people in your area, which there always was, they would follow them, and they would pick up what was left behind on the ground. So that's what the gleaning is, and that's what Ruth says to her mother-in-law. We need to eat. It's the time of the harvest. I'll go out. I'll find where they're harvesting. I'll be part of the gleaners who come behind, and maybe someone who is harvesting right now will let me come up behind and gather to glean. Maybe. Now, in Israel's history, God said, allow the gleaners. You need to provide for them. So this is not a bad idea. But the issue is it's all done under the auspices of whoever owns the land. If someone who owns the land who's harvesting says, no gleaners on my land, which God would frown against. But if they said that, you could not glean. So that's why it turns out Ruth's statement is the way it is. I'll go glean after him in whose sight I shall find favor. Now, this is not romance at this point. Come on, don't jump to the romance too fast. This is just saying, I'll go glean to wherever they'll let me. Whoever I find favor with will let me. So here we go. And she has no direction from her mother-in-law where to go. She just goes out and does it. So they're going to go out and they're going to glean and see what she can get. So then Naomi says to her, go, my daughter. So she sends her out without any more instruction. And she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was the clan of Elimelech, the now dead husband of Naomi. Wow, what a great coincidence this is. And you'll find out there is no coincidence here. This is not something that Ruth set out to do, nor Naomi gave her instructions to. She just went out to find a field and happened to actually find a field where they would let her glean that's owned by someone in the family. Boaz. And behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem, So this field is somewhere outside of Bethlehem. The scene here is Bethlehem, but somewhere outside. And he said to the reapers, these are the one working for him, cutting and collecting and gathering, "The Lord be with you." And of course they answered back, "The Lord bless you." And then he looks around and says, Boaz says to his young man who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is that? Who's that?" And by the way, too, this is not a slavery statement. Whose woman is that? Yeah, it's a very patriarchal society. And for women were either known by their connection to one of two men, either their fathers if they're young enough or their husbands. So that's what he's saying. Is this someone's daughter? Is this someone's wife? Whose woman is this? And the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "Well, she's the young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, and he's recounting what she said to him, "Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves after the reapers." So she came, and she has continued from early morning until now, except for a short rest. So she asked, he's telling the owner, Boaz, she asked if she could glean, and she looks like she's a hard worker for herself because she came early. She's been here all day working. She's diligent. She's not looking for a handout. She's working at her gleaning, and she's been here all day except for a short rest. So she's working hard. So it looks like it's working okay. So then the favor comes from Boaz. So Boaz says to Ruth, he approaches her and says, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women." That young women right there is largely the people who are wrapping the sheaves that they're picking up off the ground. "Keep close to my young women. Let your eyes be on the field that they are reaping and go after them." And then he goes on. "Have I not charged the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink what the young men have drawn." So again, I don't think we see the emergence of romance just yet. Boaz is just being decent. And he sees this young woman who has no man, basically, to protect her and take care of her, under whose charge. And he's saying, look, if you're going to glean here. I've told all the men here not to touch you. You're under my protection. So don't go anywhere else. So what he's really doing is he's warning her that even though this is Israel and this is near Bethlehem, not all the owners of the fields nor the reapers with those sickles are really pure guys. So what you need to do is stay here. Stay here and you'll be safe here, because I told these guys don't touch her. And so basically what he's saying is she's under my protection, is what he's saying. And I'm telling you, Ruth, you're under my protection because I've given instructions. Wow. That's favor. And in fact, if you get thirsty, then drink from the water that the young men have drawn. Now, by the way, we forget. Water is something that's plumbed into our house. Now, when you get thirsty, you walk up to the sink and go, psh, wow, that took a lot of work. No. When you're thirsty, water is something that someone has carried a long distance to your area and put in a pot. I mean, it's hard. When we first started doing some work camp stuff where there was home renovations down in Utah, and if some of you have been with us, many of the homes of the elderly are on the Navajo Nation, which is where we went. They had no plumbed water. They had no electricity. It was third world all over. And the water source was indeed a blue polyethylene barrel right outside the back door of this hovel, and it had a ladle in it. And so when you were thirsty, you went out to that. So how did the water get into the barrel? Well, someone in the family, a cousin or a nephew or something like that who had a truck, would load up all the blue barrels, go down to the gas station in town there where they had a water spigot on the side of the gas, and fill up all the barrels and deliver them back. So that's normal life there. If someone was not going with little pickup trucks and filling these barrels, this would be almost an impossible task to get that water to the house. Well, that's what we're talking about here. So when Boaz offers her, if you get thirsty, go ahead and use the water that these guys have worked to haul on site. That's a tremendous blessing. It's just a tremendous blessing. He is really showing her great favor. So she fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes, that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner?" Remember, she's from Moab. These are Gentiles. And all through the Old Testament, God says, beware the Gentiles, stay away from the Gentiles. The Hebrews actually would spun together a nickname for the Gentiles, dogs. So stay away from the dogs. You know, they will contaminate your belief and your trust in me with all these weird pagan junk from their past. So stay away from them. So she's one of them. She's a them. She's not an us. She's a them. So she is saying to him as she falls on her face, she says, why are you showing me favor? I'm a them. I don't even belong here. See, and she's pointing out for us, and the narrator's trying to tell us that this favor that Boaz is showing is extremely unusual, not only for someone who's a widow or an orphan in the land, but for someone who doesn't even fit there, who's a them. This is really unusual. Really unusual. And she's really struck by it. So Boaz answers her. All that you've done for your mother-in-law, that's Naomi, all that you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me. And how you left your father and mother and your native land, and you came to a people that you did not know before. Wow. Why are you showing me favor? And Boaz says, because I know all about you. I know that this exercise of faith that you've done, that you've left all your people behind, you left your parents behind, and for what? To accompany to your mother-in-law back to her home here. And you've done that sacrificially. I know that about you. This is partially why I'm showing you favor. And he goes on, and this is a fascinating statement. The Lord repay you for what you've done, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. So instead of Boaz going on in his second statement and praising the aspects of what's great about what she has done, which is what we would normally do, he would say, I know all about you. I know what you've done with your mother-in-law. For instance, and he would go down the list. He would make a whole list and just really glorify what she's done. Instead, he changes the direction to the Lord and says, you know what? The Lord sees what you've done for your mother-in-law, how lovingly you've done this. And I'm hoping that the Lord repays you for what you've done, this wonderful thing that you've done, and that you find a full reward from the Lord, not from Boaz, not from anyone else, but from the Lord, the God of Israel. Remember, that's the God that she's come to live under whose wings you've come to take refuge. So there is a fascinating redirection on his part. He could have said, I'm here to repay you, and so that's why I'm letting you do this. But he's saying, my hope is that the Lord repays you for the wonderful things you've done. The Lord repays you. And you have indeed, in faith, come to live in this land, and you put your trust in this God, the God of Israel. And see how he says it? Under whose wings you've come to take refuge. You have come here to help your mother-in-law and to kind of assume this new community, and you have deliberately put yourself under the trust of the God of Israel. Wow. And Boaz is telling her, God sees this, and God sees the love you've done toward your mother-in-law. I'm hoping he repays you totally. In a sense, and we'll come back to this, Boaz is only doing what he's sure that God's going to do for her. Boaz is showing her favor, and Boaz is saying, and God himself is going to show you favor because he's seen your heart and seen what you've done. It's interesting. We're going to come back to that. Okay, then she says, well, I have found favor in your eyes, my Lord, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I'm not even one of your servants. You've spoken kindly to your servant, even though I'm not one of your servants. You have spoken to me as though, in a lowest sense, I'm a servant of yours, but I'm not even a servant. And you've spoken to speak kindly to servants is one thing. To speak kindly to a servant is not even a servant, and yet you've spoken kindly to me. And so what she's really talking about the fact that she has no place in this society. She has no place even because as a servant she wouldn't have any place either. And yet, being in the lowest place, and that's all she's stating, I'm in the lowest place possible, and yet still you've shown me favor. Why is it in my lowest state, that's how we call it, why would you show me favor? I mean, she's just nonplussed by this. Now remember, she has no clue who Boaz is. He's just a guy who owns a field who allowed her to kind of do her stuff and glean. At this point, she does not know who Boaz is. So there's no entitlement due to family. There's nothing. She's just flummoxed. Now, think about this for a second. When we read this story up to this point, we look at what Boaz has done and we say, well, that's just a decent thing to do. We would all do that. Well, okay, sorta. But, put on the glasses of the real world and understand that in most of the real world, then and now, when a vulnerable woman comes into a place where she's needy, a man in power will seldom do this. And that's the unfortunate reality then and now. This is the casting couch in Hollywood. This is everything that you see that goes on. A woman that's in need, a man that's in power, automatically thinks, I can do that for you, but what can you do for me? Yeah. And we don't see that going on with Boaz. He's being very decent. And in this entire thing, you have to understand that in a fallen world that's completely saturated with sin, what Boaz is doing is extraordinarily unusual. He's being loving, he's being kind, he's being thoughtful, he's being protective. And again, we read this and say, well, after all, Jim, this is a romance story. The guys are always great in the romance stories. But this isn't just a story. This is a factual thing that happened. And in the ancient days then and in now, Boaz is acting against the grain of what culture would do by a lot, by a lot, by a lot. He's being a nice guy. Now you could say, well, okay, it is a story of romance. Maybe he's just smitten with her right now. Yeah. Well, no, actually we don't get any indication of that just yet. So just hold on your romance horses there. Not sure. He's just being decent. He's being thoughtful. He's being kind. He's being protective. And at this point I look at Boaz and I go, man, what a guy. That's why I said weeks ago, I said when I come as a refuge to read Ruth during the times when I am most despondent about how poorly people treat each other in the world. And I go back and I read this and I see Boaz doing the right things and for no other purposes to serve himself, just because it's the right thing to do. Still, not only is it refreshing to see someone act so compassionately, but it's really unusual, and it sparks in my mind, and we'll get to this at the end, why is it that Boaz is like this? Why isn't he like all the other jerks in the world at the time? And we'll try and answer that question. Okay, so there's a meal in the midst of this day. You take a break to eat while you're harvesting. At mealtime, which by the way in the Middle East is actually somewhere in the early afternoon. It's about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. If you go and you visit the Middle East and you want to have your big meal of the day and go to a restaurant, they'll presume you're going to do it at 2 in the afternoon. What? Yes, which is why it's kind of a stress for Americans to go to the Middle East and travel around and wonder why we're not having snacks at lunchtime. Why are we having sandwiches at lunchtime? Well, because for them the natural rhythm is a very large meal at 2 or 3 in the afternoon. That's the whole thing. So that's where we are right here, taking a break. By the way, it's the hottest time of day, which seems like a smart time to eat and sit in the shade. Yeah, okay. So mealtime, Boaz says to her, come here, eat some bread, dip your morsel in the wine. He's sharing his lunch with her. Okay, now we might be getting on the edge of a romance. But he could just be being decent. He's just sharing his food with her, because I bet you she didn't come with any food. So she sat beside the reapers, and he passed to her roasted grain, and she ate until she was satisfied, and she had some left over. Wow. Yeah, carry out. So she actually was benefiting from the grace of Boaz to such an extent. He says, here, eat. And she said, oh, I'm really full. No, here, eat. And she's got a doggy bag. This guy is being so nice to her. Wow. And this is just in the middle of the day for the reapers. I mean, there's more reaping to come, so it's crazy. So when she rose to glean, Boaz instructed his young man, saying, okay, here's the guys in charge. Let her glean even among the sheaves. That's the standing stuff, too. Let her pick out of that. And also pull out some from the bundles for her and leave it for her to glean, and don't rebuke her. So he's allowing her to do more than just glean what's left on the ground after the reaping is done. He's basically saying, look, if she goes on the edge and she starts taking standing grain, it's okay. Even if she's looking at some of the grain that's bundled, instead of tempting her, why don't you just kind of take some of those out and drop them on the ground? Do that for her. Would you do that for her? So this is in keeping with how generous he was at lunch as well. Let her glean. Don't just pick it all out and give it to her and say, go away. He says, let her glean, but kind of, let's give her something really fun to glean. So that's what he tells them to do. And here's the haul at the end of the day. So she gleaned in the field until evening, until you can't see anymore to do it. And then she beat out what she had gleaned, and it was about an ephah of barley. So this is the post-processing. We already talked about this. She beat out her grain, her barley, to kind of process it. By the way, how much is an ephah? Ephah. I love that word, ephah. Well, I had to look again. I always forget. An ephah is 10 omers. What's your problem? Okay, what's an omer? Okay, an omer is about a half a gallon of milk size. So if you think about a half a gallon of milk, that's an omer. So 10 of those is like having 10 half gallons of milk sitting on your counter. So I checked out some other sources. They all agree. And someone tried to figure out how much this would weigh. This would weigh about 30 pounds. This is 30 pounds of grain. This is a haul. This is a lot of grain. A lot of grain. Wow. I don't know how she could even carry it. 30 pounds of grain. Have you ever carried a 30-pound sack of anything? No. And she's got to take this from the fields and from the area where it's going to be processed and take it back home. I mean, this is a gigantic haul. I think for Naomi, who's still sitting at home and sends Ruth out to do this, she's probably thinking, well, maybe Ruth will hit some pay dirt. Maybe someone will let her glean around the edges. I don't know. But, if she comes back with an omer or two, that would be great. She comes back with 10 omers. By the way, you know what 10 ephahs are? If 10 omers are an ephah, 10 ephahs are a homer. Doesn't that mess up your head? Right. Okay. So anyway, yeah. A homer. Okay. So she beats it out. So she processes it. And she beats it out to separate the heads off the stalks, to separate the hulls off of it, and then probably blows it so the hulls are off of it. So she processes it. She beats it out. And that's what we saw. Now, when we were in Israel about 12 years ago, we went to a place on a hillside out in the middle of nowhere. And actually, that's Bethlehem in the distance on the top of that hill. But this is a particular rock outcropping. It's a natural rock outcropping. That's Bethlehem. And by the way, that's Scott down there. There he is. And some of the rest of us are in there. I see Rebecca, our daughter. And there's Dorothy. And where's Betsy? Betsy, where are you? I don't see. I don't see. Anyway, this is our friend from New Zealand right here. Oh, you don't care about that. Okay, so what are we standing on? We're standing on a threshing place for barley and wheat. Because, you remember the original picture I showed you of them doing that separation process? Remember they had a black tarp on the ground? Because if you're solid wheat, your food falls to the ground and chaff gets blown sideways. If it falls into muddy, icky dirt, and then you have to collect it together, ew. So what you want to do is find a nice concrete pad someplace and do this for your... Well, they don't have concrete pads in Israel back in that day. So you look for a rock outcropping, usually at the top of a hill, because it'll be relatively flat instead of like this. It'll be flat. And you use that as a place where you'll drop your grain, even when you'll actually roll the husks off, the hulls off. Sometimes the animals are walking around just to step on it, just to roll the husks off. You'll do that on a place that's relatively clean, because at the end, you're going to scoop up your food off of what you did this to. So you look for rock outcropping. This is a very prominent threshing rock outcropping outside of Bethlehem. And there are not very many of these because they geographically only show up in a couple places in the area. Could this actually have been the threshing floor where she beat out her grain and blew her grain? It could very well be, because we knew it was outside of Bethlehem. Where's Bethlehem in the picture? Psh, out in the distance over there. This could be it. By the way, too, why is there a rock wall around the edge of it? I'll do a close-up of what the ground looks like right there. Why is there a rock wall? Keep the cows out. Keep the sheep out. Because if they see this nice, dry, warm place to lay down, and then they all over the place, then where you collect up your food off the ground is going to be icky. So you put a rock wall around it. And you use the most abundant building material in all of Israel, rocks. They're everywhere. Limestone everywhere. And by the way, if you take a look at this limestone right here, you notice how weathered it is? It looks like a street almost. If you look at ancient streets, there have been a lot of people walking on this for a long time. Doing what? Processing grain. Processing grain. If you have a small amount of grain to process, you can knock the heads off on the ground, you can collect them together in a little circle, and you can kind of do the grape stomp on them like this. Just to kind of do this stuff, but with your feet instead, and then all of a sudden you have them together. Then you have to collect them up together and drop them and blow them and hope the wind takes them. But that all goes on right here, and in the end, your food comes off of that surface. So that's where she is, and that's what she's been doing. She took it up and went into the city. See, she's not in the city. She's not in Bethlehem. She's away from Bethlehem. I think this might be the place. Her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. There should be an exclamation mark right there. Whoa, I saw what she had gleaned. And she also brought out and gave her what food she had left over after being satisfied. So she brings back these 10 omers and then also her doggy bag from lunch. From the extra food. So she comes back. Her mother-in-law is absolutely flabbergasted by the size of the 30 pounds of grain she has. And she says, well, mother, guess what? I also have lunch for you as well. And brings in the extra food she's had from lunch from this guy. So Ruth is showing her mother-in-law, Naomi, that something remarkable happened today. Because look at this haul. This is far beyond Naomi's ever thoughts or dreams. Wow, you hit pay dirt today. Wow, this is incredible. So her mother-in-law said to her, where did you glean today? Where did you glean? And where have you worked? Wow, blessed be the man who took notice of you. Exclamation mark, question marks, exclamation, question. She's flabbergasted. Where did you glean today? You've got 30 pounds of grain. Who would let you walk away with 30 pounds of grain? Man. And lunch to boot. And dinner for the two of us. Well, where have you been? Who's this guy that allowed you to do this? Oh, wow. So she told her mother-in-law with whom she had worked. And she said, well, the man's name with whom I work today is Boaz. Boaz. And a little bell goes off in Naomi's head. Boaz? 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 And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, may he be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. What's that mean, forsaken the living or the dead? Well, Boaz is showing kindness to Naomi, the living, and also showing kindness to the dead, Elimelech, and then the sons who died as well, who can no longer care for these women. He's showing kindness to all of them by taking care. That's all she's saying. This is a tremendous favor. He's being so kind to us, so kind to us. And then she goes on, and Naomi also said, the man is a close relative of ours, dun dun dun, one of our redeemers, one of our Gaal. What? I'm not sure Ruth knew what that meant. She might have. But there's something special here. He is a close relative of ours and one of our Gaal, one of our redeemers. There's something more going on here than just the fact that you met a really nice guy today. What a coincidence that he happens to be part of Elimelech's family. That's why the mood music has to go boom, boom, boom right there, because that means something big. And we're going to come back to this word. You can read that, right? Gaal? Yeah, whatever. He's one of our redeemers, and we're going to talk about that. This is probably one of the most important themes from Ruth, and it ends up being applicable to a gigantic part of the Old Testament and the New Testament. This redeemer idea. Wow. He's one of our redeemers. That's why I also didn't read verse 1. Did you notice that I started verse 2 today? Verse 1 is kind of like a plot spoiler, so I didn't want to let you know about Boaz. It said Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name is Boaz. Bad storytelling. You're not supposed to have that go out at the beginning of the story. You're supposed to bring it out at the end, which is why I did it that way. But this is also the writer of Ruth. It's his way of saying this was a prearrangement by God. In the story, you realize that no one knew she was going to go to Boaz's field. It's sort of a surprise. And Naomi is surprised when she finds out it's Boaz, and this guy is one of the people of Elimelech's family. This is just an extraordinary sovereignty of God, not a coincidence. The sovereignty of God. Boaz. So let's finish this story. So Ruth the Moabite said, besides, he said to me, you shall keep close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. It's a fascinating thing. I mean, Naomi just says, this guy's part of our family. And she says, well, he was also really nice to me. You see this? In fact, when that word besides, badly translated, you should put in our modern vernacular word, whatever. Really, because Naomi says, he's one of our kin. He's one of our redeemers. And Ruth says, yeah, whatever. He was really nice to me. You shall keep close by my young men until they finished all my harvest. I mean, that's what he offered, and that's what I did. So he's one of our kin. He's one of our redeemers. Yeah, whatever. He was really nice to me. I love Ruth's heart when she says this. She's just saying what's really obvious. I don't know what connection you're talking about necessarily, Naomi, but I do know what a nice guy. What a nice guy. He protected me. He gave to me more than he had to. What a nice guy. A gal, I don't know where that figures, but I have been blessed today by the favor of the guy who is just really tremendously nice. I love Ruth's heart. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, well, it's good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, lest in another field you be assaulted. So they've kind of completely skirted around the whole Redeemer question, and we're stuck back there a couple verses back saying, well, what about this Redeemer thing? And Ruth says, well, he was really nice to me. He let me glean with him. And then Naomi says, yeah, it's good for you to stay with his guys. Well, let's talk about the Redeemer thing. Well, don't worry about it. We'll get there. Next chapter, we'll get there. But we are just kind of sewing up the fact that this guy dealt with her in such a kind and generous and gracious way that regardless of whether he's family or not, what a nice guy. That's what Ruth recognizes, and so does Naomi. So to kind of close out this chapter of the story, so she kept close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. So she goes all the way through both harvests, March, April for barley, April, May for the wheat. We come up to about June. So this is like several months we're talking here. And during that time, she lived with her mother-in-law. So, but what about the Redeemer thing? Oh, just chill. We'll get there. We'll get there. All you got to remember for today is this is a remarkably kind man who was remarkably kind to a stranger. So what it brings to my mind is the question that she originally says about why him. So remember I said this is a romance of faith, hope, and love. Does she have hope today? Does she have cause to have hope today? Was this a good day in the hope calendar? Yeah, and I'll let me list three things. She had a surprising harvest. She discovered a faithful God, and she found a really nice guy. Now, if you're into romance novels, you don't read those first two, you just read the last one. I found a really nice guy. But she's struggling with having left behind her entire culture, her people, even her relatives, and her gods, plural, the pagans, and she's come into this new culture, new people, new God. And at the same time, they're struggling to figure all this kind of stuff out. Ruth is trying to figure where I've come to a good place. And a lot of that good place has to do with the God and the God whose people are here. So all this stuff, she's weighing all this stuff all the time. So at the end of today, she has hope to believe that number one, because of this surprising harvest, yes, I have hope that things are going to go good. I got 30 pounds of grain and take home for my mother-in-law. I found that God is indeed faithful. In fact, let's go back and look at some of these. This surprising harvest. Remember before they went back, Naomi said that I heard that the Lord has visited his people and given them food. That rings in her ears. That was part of what established her faith to come back. And now that she's there and she's seeing this food and she brings 30 pounds home, she's saying, yes, the Lord has visited his people and brought food. Even from Naomi's bench, she understands that this has nothing to do with the superior agrarian wisdom of the people living in the land. This has to do with God himself. So for her to see this food and for her to have so much of it is for her a gigantic point about the fact that this God is indeed faithful. And remember another way, when Naomi is blessing her daughters-in-law, she says, may the Lord deal kindly with you. So Ruth looks at Naomi, and Naomi says to her in chapter 1, and comes fulfilled here, that the Lord himself is the one who brings good to the land of Israel. And if you see food in Israel, it's because the Lord has visited and brought it. By the way, that's a theme throughout the entire Old Testament and the New. But in the Old Testament, if you remember, God located the people of Israel on the top of a hill instead of on a river delta like the Nile Delta. The Nile Delta, when they were enslaved in Egypt, the Nile comes down. The Nile brings you all the water from the continent of Africa. And it comes there, it spreads out the Nile Delta as it goes into the Mediterranean. Really great growing area. You never have a problem with water in Egypt because you got all the water from Africa there. But God says, when I put you in the land that I promised, I'm going to put you at the top of the hills. At the top of the hills. Because I want you to be dependent on me for rain and for dew to water your plants. And then you will be reminded about the fact that everything you eat comes out of my hands. That's why I do that. For instance, here in Utah, how much of the population of Utah lives right at the base of this ridge of mountains that runs north and south in the state? I mean, almost the entire population. And why? Well, because streams come out of the mountains, and everywhere in a canyon where a stream comes out, you can find a prominent population in Utah. They populated it that way. Do you go to the top of the mountains to live? No, because there's no streams up there. They're at the bottom of the mountains. But with God, God says, I want you at the top of the mountain. So you understand that the rain and the dew comes from me. So that's what's talking about here. So this is all from the hand of God. Surprising harvest. And so it really fuels our understanding that God is indeed faithful, because look what he's done for his people here. And even Boaz reinforces the presence of God in this blessing. May the Lord repay you for what you've done, and full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take refuge. So even in the good times, and even what should be an unnoticed thing that Ruth has done, Boaz is reiterating to her what everyone in Israel knows, which is God sees and God delights in good that you do. He does. And he's saying, may God repay you for that. Now, before you go off on a works-based salvation, don't go there. That's not the issue. The issue is Boaz is saying, the good that you do in secret, and that's not even noticed. God sees it. God understands. And God is thrilled by the fact that you and Boaz, but you saw in your heart to give to your mother-in-law in a way that was sacrificial to you. God notices that. Why does God notice that? Because that's very much what God is like. God loves us sacrificially. He came to his own, and his own didn't receive him. But to those who did receive him, he gave the right to become children of God. So yeah, God is faithful, and she's seeing this in front of her own eyes. And so kind of to complete the romance thing, and she did find a nice guy. Okay, found a nice guy. But because of that, she has all these reasons to hope. Remember, Boaz, the nice guy, says, have I not charged this young man not to touch you? Wow. And also, this shows us that for some reason, Boaz is built to protect even those who have no one to protect them. It's interesting. It's all about this protection from a guy who doesn't have to. I've charged young men not to touch you, and when you're thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from young men what they've drawn. So here's this nice kind of beginning clue to the fact that he's also in for her provision, to provide for her both water and necessary, and even food. And he goes on with the provision. At mealtime, Boaz says, come here, eat some bread, dip your morsel in the wine, which, by the way, is a great luxury, to dip your morsel in wine. Great luxury. She ate until she was satisfied, and then she had some left over. That is a great picture of grace right there. Because even if Boaz was inclined to be nice to her and to provide for her, like water's the necessary thing, but what if he goes beyond that? Says, here's the water right here, and oh, by the way, for lunch you can dip in my wine. That's grace. That's going beyond what she deserves. And oh, by the way, in terms of grace, have some lunch, and here's some, and you don't have to have my lunch with me, but I want you to have lunch with me. And I want you to have more than you can even eat right now. I want you to have so much lunch that you can't eat anymore. Not just a little bit for lunch. That's grace. So grace is always the idea of receiving something that goes far beyond what you really deserve. Now Ruth didn't deserve any of this from Boaz, but especially this extra mile she didn't deserve. And that's why she's so flummoxed in the actual narrative. Why are you doing this for me? I'm a stranger. I'm a foreigner. There's more of this grace. Let her glean among the sheaves and don't reproach her. I mean, go to the good stuff and also pull out some of the bundles and leave it for her to glean and don't rebuke her. So we see a guy who's not only just a nice guy, he's actively living out the idea of protection for those who have no protection and provision for those who have no good, and going beyond the provision to grace for what they don't deserve. Now, when you put those together, he goes far beyond Mr. Nice Guy in my book. He's something else in so many ways. In fact, he's showing many of the characteristics of who God himself is. So it made me wonder, just like with Ruth, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me? I'm a foreigner. I just don't get this. And I think here she's partially reminiscing on where she came from back in Moab. If I was back in Moab and I was doing this, no one in Moab would do this for me. Why are you doing this for me? I don't get this. This just goes against the grain. Now, if you think that the idea of being abused when you're in a needy position is a foreign thing in Israel, it's not, because he was even saying, don't go glean anywhere else here because it's dangerous for you. So she knows that all of it's just, this is so unusually good that she's scratching her head and going, why is he being so good? And it made me wonder, why is Boaz being so good? I mean, from God's laws in the state of Israel, in the nation, he only has to provide protection and provision for strangers and for orphans. I mean, you can't push them out. But he's gone far beyond. This is a strange thing. So it caused me to wonder about that. I mean, where are the men like Boaz today? I mean, where are the Boaz types? And many women say, are there any more Boazes in the world? I want one of those. I want one of those. And even when you read the Old Testament, they're few and far between. I mean, this is a classy guy. Where do I find a Boaz? Sign me up for a Boaz. I want a Boaz. So it got me to thinking, why is Boaz the way he is? Is Boaz the way he is because God just commanded it in Israel? He's just doing this out of obedience to God? Is Boaz doing this because he's smitten in love with Ruth? And when you read the next chapter, I don't think that's happened yet. So why is Boaz so exceptional? I chewed on that for a while. Because of his own mother. Let's go back to the genealogy. If you go back to the genealogy, you'll find something amazing about Boaz. Now look, okay, I know this is boring stuff. Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse. Okay, so if you look at Ruth right there, did I highlight that? No, I didn't. Sorry. Go back. Go back. So Boaz, who's Boaz's parents? Salmon and Rahab. Boaz's mother is the prostitute from Jericho. Boaz's mother is the prostitute from Jericho. Israelite? No. Canaanite. The wretched Canaanites. The pagan gods worshiping Canaanites. His mother is a stranger to the nation of Israel. And yet his mother is someone who understood the protection and provision and grace of God. Makes me wonder that when Rahab and her husband Salmon were sitting around the table with the little boy Boaz, said, son, can we tell you something about what happened when, as the nation of Israel, we crossed the Jordan, we came up to Jericho, and then your mom did something astonishing for the nation of Israel and put her trust in the God of Israel. Can we tell you about that? And by the way, isn't it an astonishing thing that God saw that and repaid her by bringing her into the nation of Israel, and she herself understood the protection, provision, and grace of God in a place and in a way it should never have happened because she is a wretched Canaanite. Boaz himself is a half-breed. He's not a fully Israeli. He's half Canaanite. And that's not the end of the story. Because as they're sitting around the table, eating their porridge made out of barley, eating their porridge, and his mom is talking about the incredible grace of God when this whole Jericho thing went down. Now she's been incorporated into the blessings and under the wings of the God of Israel. This woman who should never have been incorporated, not only because she's Canaanite, but she's a prostitute. Oh my gosh. And she's just gushing about the God of Israel and how gracious he is to me. Then Salmon would peek up and say, well, that's not all, son. Do you know my history, son? Since I was with the group of people who came into Israel, that means I was a child of my parents, and my parents' generation all perished in the desert. Remember, when they left Egypt, they came across the desert. They came all the way up to the edge of the promised land. They sent the spies, and the spies came back and said, oh, it's wonderful, but there's giants. We can't go in there. And then, a couple of guys said, no, we can do this because it's not about us. It's about God. Let's go in. And God says, okay, you guys failed. You failed. So because you would not go into the land, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb, but because you wouldn't go into the land, I'm going to have your generation, Nashon. I'm going to have your generation die here in the desert. And your children, Salmon, will go into the land. So Salmon would pep up and say, you know what? I grew up in the desert. And you know why I grew up in the desert? Because my parents wouldn't believe the fact that God had given us this land. But while we were in the desert, a miracle happened. A miracle happened. You would think that stuck in the desert for an entire generation, where are you going to find food? Where are you going to find water? How are you going to survive? And you know what God did with my parents and us, even though they were disobedient, and they were all disobedient? You know what God did? He brought water in the desert for us to drink, and he brought food that would come down at night and hang on the bushes at night, and we ate. We ate like that for 4 decades. God provided for us every single day, even for those who were disobedient to God's command. Can you believe the God that we have, who even in our disobedience, he fed us and watered us? That's a gracious God, because we did not deserve that. That's what Salmon would say over the table. And of course, his wife, Rahab, would go, yes, gracious God we have. Yes, gracious God we have. So how is it, by the way, too, and of course these conversations around the table are all made up by me. You know that, right? But I can't help but think this influence is strong with Boaz. Because then they could go back one more notch and say, and Salmon could say, and let me tell you about my grandfather and my father. They lived in the land of Egypt. And Egypt was good for us for a while. Things went south. And we became slaves. We became dishwashers and tenders of animals. It's pretty bad. But you know what? The interesting thing is that while we were there, God saw us and saw that we were strangers in their land. And even while we were strangers in their land, God took care of us. And he would say, you know what? We were at one time strangers in another place. And yet by the grace of God, God took care of us. So around this conversation, Boaz has no way of escaping the fact that God's grace comes to those who don't deserve it. God takes care of those who are far outside the plan, Rahab, prostitute Canaanite. God takes care of those who are outside the plan. God loves the strangers in the world because after all, you yourselves were strangers once. If you yourselves were strangers in Egypt, you yourself should love the stranger. Now Boaz has been carefully sculpted by God through his parents' experience, through his grandparents' experience, through all that he's seen and heard. He is so predisposed to love the stranger because after all, that's his parents. See it? In Leviticus, God commands, when a stranger sojourns with you, when they come through your land, in your land, you shall not do him wrong, which was the typical thing that happened during the time. You won't do him wrong. You shall treat the stranger who sojourns with you as the native among you, as a Hebrew. And you shall love him as yourself. Not just treat him well, you shall love him. That's grace. For you were strangers in the land of Egypt. I'm the Lord your God. You were strangers in Egypt at one time. So when a stranger comes into your land, love them. And so when Boaz sees this young woman gleaning every part of what God has constructed in him through his parents and through the word, everything that God has done to sculpt this man uniquely, sees this stranger woman and everything about him and says, love her. Love her. The nation of Israel and God himself loved my mom, who was an outcast, even in the Canaanites. Saw my parents who died in the desert who disobeyed, but God still provided. I need to love the stranger because my family is full of strangers that have been loved. He can hardly help himself, really. He can hardly help himself. And why is this part of who he is? Isn't only the fact that he's been sculpted this way through his parents, but God is actually glorifying himself in the characteristics of God's love for us in all of that. In all of that. God loves the stranger. And we're all strangers. I mean, we're all strangers. I think I even have a verse on this. Yeah. Matthew 25. This is Jesus talking about the end judgment. Remember this? I was hungry, you gave me food. I was thirsty, you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. Boy, this sounds like Boaz. And this is what Jesus is saying is characteristic of everyone who loves God with all their heart. They'll act this way. And why? Because that's how God loves as well. God loves the stranger. God loves the people who don't deserve his love. God brings grace on those who don't deserve his grace. And Boaz is acting exactly like God. He's got God's heart in action, trained through his parents' experience. How about another one? Check this out. Ephesians 2. Remember, you were at that time separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, an outsider, strangers to the covenants of promise, having no hope without God in the world. Goes a couple verses, and then he says, so now you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. I've always thought Rahab could have said that last sentence at breakfast with Boaz. She was a stranger. She was an outsider. But she could say to her son, but look, I am no longer a stranger and an alien. I am a fellow citizen with the saints, with Israel, and a member of the household of God. I was once outside, and now God's brought me in. And that's our story. We were once outside, and God brought us in. And in his graciousness, he gave to us what we never deserved. And so what we see Boaz doing is exactly who God is in a man. And so Boaz's actions don't so much glorify himself. They glorify God. They glorify God, under whose wings you've come to live. Wow, it's just astonishing. It's just astonishing. You shall love him as yourself, for you yourselves were once strangers as well. We're going to have to stop right there. The story gets even more interesting next week. But Boaz isn't just in a romance novel a nice guy. Boaz is a guy who's been sculpted by God carefully over generations to be different than the rest of the world. To be someone whose actions reflect the actions and the heart of God himself. So that in doing what he does, he glorifies God. And in glorifying God, Ruth has a hope that's rooted in God and not in Boaz. See that? Where have I come to? Who are these people? Who is this God? Well, if Boaz is a product of these people and this God is something else. He's really something else and glorifies God in the process. So one kind of final note before we let this go for the day. You know, you yourself are in a Boaz position. God has sculpted you in very unique ways. In very unique ways. He's used your parents, like Salmon and Rahab. He's used people that you've run across in life. And in many respects, what he's been doing in this term that we call sanctification, he's been chipping off the rough edges on you so that more and more it's not about being qualified for heaven. It's about the fact that now in your regular life, you start exhibiting the heart of God in the things you do. That's why he sanctifies you. Because then people will look at you like they looked at Boaz, and Ruth can fall on her face and say, I don't get it. Why are you so nice to me? And he can point to the God under whose wings you've come to live. And the same is true for you as well. You are a standout by God's construction in this place. Yes, we need to do good to people. Yes, we need to love strangers, people we don't know. But that's not really the issue. The issue isn't ethics and morality. The issue is glorifying God. And in this very dark place that we live in, the only people who glorify God are the people like you and I that God has sculpted to reflect his heart in actions with the people that we meet. And they are most in contrast when it's with people you have no clue who they are. They're not part of anything you're doing. They're just people that are there. Jesus says, if you're going to invite someone to dinner, don't invite someone who can invite you back. Invite someone who can invite you back. Strangers. So we are indeed strangers in a strange land, but we are sculpted by God to glorify who he is by how he's changed us, like Boaz was changed. And then we, along with Ruth, now 2,000 years later, we look at that and go, man, that's unusual. And what has changed? What has caused this? The finger of God. He's glorifying himself through Boaz. So yes, the bottom line question, does she have hope at the end of today? Yeah. But I would argue that her hope is greater in who God is than it is in who Boaz is. Although when we read this just as a romance novel, we see Boaz as being cool stuff, nice guy. But there's something that has regenerated in her. Her faith has been rewarded by a fact, and that fact is the visible working of God through people like Boaz and others. And she's saying to herself, not so much, gee, I'm glad I met Boaz. She's saying, I'm glad I've come to these people, and I'm glad I've come to these people's God. Because look, there's a prime example. What kind of God do they have? And that's your role and my role too. Otherwise, God should have just snatched us home when we gave our lives to him. He says, get out of there. It's a deeply bad place. It's full of muck up to your eyeballs. It's a bad influence on you. You need to get out of there right now. And he pulls us out of here. But instead he says, no, I'm going to slowly chip away at you and sanctify you so that everywhere you walk in the most routine things you do during the day, even if it's just harvesting your grain, you'll glorify who I am. God's got a lot invested in you for just that. Okay. We're going to sing The Hope of the Poor. Because today, romance of faith and hope. Okay. Father in heaven, we thank you for this story. It just gives me goosebumps to revisit this and to hear what goes on. Lord, how I would have loved to have been one of those people just reaping and watching what's going on, to understand, to see this blossoming relationship, to see this Boaz, this man that you have so carefully sculpted through his parents and through the experience he's gone through, to see him glorify who you are and in such an unusual way bring glory to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the one who loves us tremendously, the one whose heart goes out to strangers as well as those who are known. And Lord, as we close, I am thankful too that there was a time in which I was a stranger to you. And yet that didn't stop the forward action of your love toward me. You pursued me anyway. Even when I wasn't even aware that you were there, you pursued me. And Lord, for all of us, we can say that. Like Paul said in Ephesians, at one time we were all strangers. And yet, we look up and realize that you've called us to be a part of your family. We are no longer strangers. We're part of who you are. And we are radically being transformed to look more and more like you because we have fallen in love with your love for us. And we love because you loved us first. And you changed us. And we can't stop ourselves when we see a stranger or when we see someone who's without help from someone else or the weak that are around us. We can't help ourselves. Because at one time we were strangers too. And we experienced the love of God. So God, I pray that through the ordinary places you take us this week, that you would open our eyes to those who need to understand that kind of a touch, to understand in the reality of the touch of these contacts, the great loving kindness of this God who has touched us and continues to touch others through us, so that you might be glorified and not ourselves. Boaz is a nice guy. We're nice people. But you are an extraordinary God. So thank you now in Jesus' name. Amen.